वेलकम बैक आफ्टर द ब्रेक। गुफ्तगू को मजीद आगे बढ़ाएंगे और ये जानने की कोशिश करेंगे कि जो अमेरिका में सदारती इंतखाबात जारी हैं, उन इंतखाबात ने अब किस रुख मजीद आगे बढ़ना है और सूरत हाल क्या होगी। हमें प्रोग्राम में ज्वाइन करें अमेरिका से ही दो लोग अभी मेरे साथ मौजूद हैं। प्रोफेसर एलिज़ाबेथ लॉरेस। प्रोफेसर एलिज़ाबेथ लॉरेस प्रोफेसर हैं पॉलिटिकल साइंस इंटरनेशनल अफेयर्स यूनिवर्सिटी ऑफ मैरी वाशिंगटन, इंटरनेशनल रिलेशंस की एक्सपर्ट हैं। वर्जीनिया से हमें ये ज्वाइन कर रही हैं। इनके साथ मौजूद होंगे रॉस फाइनगोल्ड। रॉस फाइनगोल्ड जो है वो एशिया पॉलिटिकल रिस्क एनालिस्ट एंड फॉर्मर रिपब्लिकन अब्रॉड एशिया के चेयरमैन हैं। Welcome both of you to the program. I would like to begin my conversation with Mr. Feingold. Mr. Feingold, help me understand what is going on in US and what do you think who is going to be the president? Do you know this $1 million answer?
I wish I did, and probably billions of people around the world are wondering the same thing at the moment. The key battleground states are working their way through a very large number of mailed-in ballots. It's a unique situation for these election officials and their employees to have to deal with literally hundreds of thousands, or in some cases millions of ballots in a particular state, which is due to the pandemic this year. Many people chose to vote by mail. It's unfortunate that it's taking too long. Fortunately, there are observers from both political parties, so the likelihood of fraud is relatively low, but there is the possibility that votes might get counted which were submitted after applicable deadlines. And that's something that the legal battle will be over, is whether or not the ballots that are being counted are eligible to be counted, or if they arrived after a deadline. And then the usual issues that occur with mailed-in ballots in the United States are whether there are stray pen marks, which would usually make a ballot invalid, whether if there's a signature requirement, people forget to put their signature, one side or the other will then challenge that ballot. So there are a lot of technical reasons why ballots might get thrown out as well.
Right.
But we have to be very realistic. The number of ballots that typically get thrown out usually don't make a difference in the election results in the United States. And given where the count is for either Vice President or former Vice President Biden or President Trump in any particular state, they could do a recount or they could finish counting soon. But when a candidate has a lead of this amount, this many hours, or now getting into 2 days after the close of voting and the beginning of counting, it becomes increasingly unlikely that one or the other side will find more ballots to help their side.
Right. Elizabeth, help me understand that, when Trump came into power in 2016, we saw the world changing, the U.S. elections, turning out to be which the world never expected. And everyone here, was expecting that Hillary Clinton is the one who's going to win these elections. And it just flipped. And now things have changed. But the results we're getting right now are not really changed. I mean, they're changed, but they're not really changed. There's a larger number of people there in the U.S. who are there for Trump. And by this I mean they're for his school of thought, his vision, his mission, whatever he says. So by Trump, we relate someone or a school of thought who is more about, vocal, who's more open towards things, who is more open towards racism, more open towards white supremacy, more open towards his immigration policy and all that. So what kind of generation is this who is, behind Trump, or the Trump vision, whatever it is? Is this right? Is this wrong? If this is right, then why? If this is wrong, then why?
President Trump enjoys a lot of support because precisely there's been a backlash in the United States against those labels that you just used: racism, xenophobia, homophobia, that kind of thing. In 2016, if you weren't for Hillary Clinton and you supported Trump, you were labeled something that labeled, and it ended in IST, right? And so Americans came out against that, and they thought, well, why am I going to vote for a party that calls me a racist or a homophobe or xenophobic or something like that? And so there was this groundswell of support for President Trump, or Trump as a candidate, who really rejected a lot of those notions. And you see it in this election. Voter turnout for both Democrats and Republicans are historically high. In fact, it appears that more people voted for President Trump in 2020 than in 2016, again, indicating that they agree with his policies, but also that they disagree with the Democratic policies, and also the Democrats beating Republicans over the head with a bunch of labels. A clear indication of this is how well Republicans did in the House and in keeping the Senate. Sans the election, the presidential election, which is still undetermined, and I agree with Ross Feingold that the numbers, I'm not a betting man, but the numbers do seem to favor Biden at this point. But, the Republicans did hold on to the Senate, where there was tremendous hope on the part of Democrats that they would take the Senate and Chuck Schumer would be Senate Majority Leader. And then in the House, Republicans and Republican women picked up a number of seats in the House. Now, some people are saying, well, that calls into question Nancy Pelosi's leadership as Speaker. But the way I interpret that is it actually gives her some shelter from some of the more progressive elements in the Democratic Party. That if the Democrats had won big, the progressive sector of the Democratic Party would have taken the message that, we are on the rise, we are ascending. Right now, because of the Democratic, losses in the House and the inability to take the Senate, and then, of course, the Republican victories, that this might put a brake on the more progressive wing of the Democratic Party.
Right. Okay, so whoever wins, there's a question that always remains in our mind, especially, sitting in this part of the world. The question is, I would like to ask this question from Mr. Feingold. There's an understanding that the U.S. foreign policy remains the same, the principal policy remains the same. I've been asking this question multiple times in my programs recently we're doing on this U.S. elections. Help me understand, the policy remains the same, the principal policy remains the same, or it changes with the change of the person sitting in the Oval Office? How it happens? I mean, does it really happen or it doesn't happen?
Well, the first step, again, assuming that Biden does become the president, is he'll have to put together a team. The assumption of a lot of people, which I think is a fair assumption, is that he's going to bring back a lot of people who served in the Obama administration. And depending on their age, frankly, some people who might have also served in the Clinton administration in the 1990s. So whether it's U.S. policy towards the Indo-Pacific region, Europe, the Middle East, we're probably going to see at the senior levels a large number of familiar faces. Those policies that the Obama administration, with Vice President Biden at the time heavily involved in foreign policy making, I think your comment would have applied at the time. So a lot of continuity on foreign policy issues, whether it was Obama or George W. Bush, Bill Clinton, George H.W. Bush, and maybe in a previous era, we might make the observation that you just did about continuity. But clearly, President Trump, again, whether it was Europe or Indo-Pacific, other parts of the world, had a very different approach to a large number of issues. It's very clear how President Trump felt about multilateral agreements and institutions. He withdrew from the World Health Organization, Paris Climate Accord, the Iran nuclear agreement. He pressured a lot of U.S. allies to spend more on defense. We saw that in both Europe as well as in Japan and South Korea. On the other hand, he was willing to meet with Kim Jong-un and at least attempt some other bold moves. And of course, the relationship that he built with India and the policy moves against China. So looking at this part of the world, there's certainly a lot of concern among observers such as myself and potentially government leaders about whether or not Biden will continue the posture of the Trump administration or he's going to return to the more traditional methods of foreign policy. If he continues many of the initiatives of the Trump administration, then your observation would apply. There'd be continuity, but we'd have to keep in mind that President Trump did make a lot of changes compared to a more traditional approach. If President Biden goes back to the Obama, George W. Bush style of engagement and faith in multilateral approaches to different issues, trying to talk to China rather than treat China as a strategic risk to the United States, there'd be continuity, but it would be undoing what Trump did and returning to a previous style of foreign policy.
Right. Okay. So, Elizabeth, this is the foreign policy we spoke about right now. Help me understand the policy of Trump in these past 4 years within the U.S. How do you summarize his policies as compared to his statement before he came into the power, continuing from the immigrants and till date?
Well, President Trump certainly put America first, right? And that was his campaign slogan, Make America Great Again, America First. And he did that not by pursuing multilateral initiatives, as former presidents had done, but by bilateral relations. And, he tweaked a lot of noses. He pulled the U.S. out of some UN bodies. He went over to NATO and said, you got to pony up some more money there, which, they eventually did, right? Former presidents had done the same thing, and the countries in NATO hadn't followed through, and Trump kind of, held their feet to the fire. And so, probably his greatest achievement, to be honest with you, is in the Middle East. Oh my gosh, I've been around for, several decades, and ever since I was, in grade school, it's always like Middle East peace process, on, it's off, it's on, it's off. So he made substantial progress there, but he did it in a different way. Again, not through multilateral institutions. So I do think if we see a President Biden, you will see a return to multinationalism and multilateralism. And I do think Biden, for being chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee for so many years, we did not see a lot of action on China. Now, China was not as strong, as it is now, many years ago. But there's really no indication that he has a solid, definable China policy. And so I would agree with Ross Feingold there that that is some cause for concern, particularly, in the Pentagon. Biden and Harris had said, they were actually going to cut defense spending at a time when we're trying to grow the Navy in particular. In the Asia Pacific, in the Indo-Pacific, right? President Trump expanded that region to the Indo-Pacific. It's going to be about maritime issues, right? China wants to be the maritime power there. The U.S. has been the maritime power there since the end of World War II. And so, our Navy has been crippled, in numbers, and China can count. China can see that. So I think that's going to be a very big difference. I do think also a President Biden would push more on human rights. President Trump came from what's called the realist school of international relations, which is, if you don't mind the term, it's more pragmatic. Right? You're suspicious of your enemies. You take your victories where you can. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. Those types of calculations. Whereas Biden's more from what's called the liberal school, which looks much more to the UN and multilateral organizations for peacekeeping. But the problem is some of those multilateral organizations can't really get their act together. Right. And China and Russia are big players on them. So they can thwart U.S. and Western efforts there.
But if we go by this rule, so we have seen, like you've mentioned about the defense budget, so it's around $732 billion that U.S. is spending right now on its defense only. If this sort of spending on the defense is the solution, then help me understand why Trump is pulling all the troops from all the war zones. We've seen, Afghanistan, we've seen Syria, and we have seen Iraq as well, and we have seen that Trump or the U.S. administration has come up to a solution that war is no solution, basically. We need to talk. So that's why you're sitting here with the Taliban, with the help of Pakistan, and you are finally discussing and talking. So, spending this much on defense one side and finally ending up in talking. And the third thing that you've mentioned is, establishing more about the naval things. What is going on? I mean, there's something missing somewhere. I'm not, really understanding what the U.S. really wants.
No, I can help you there. The focus is shifting. We have been in Afghanistan, in Iraq for about 20 years, right? And so there is not a lot of U.S. domestic support for that anymore. That's been a really, really long slog. So, remember President Trump came in saying that we're going to get, out of that, no more wars, right? So, again, President Trump comes from, well, I think his advisors come more from the realist school, right? Where they're saying that, deterrence is the best way to peace, right? That, you are strong. And I think Reagan said, like, peace through strength, right? And in a nutshell. And so how do you be strong? You have to build up your military. So the focus is from Central Asia and, Iraq, Afghanistan, where we have been for 20 years, to the Indo-Pacific, particularly maritime Indo-Pacific. But, also he's shifting some troops from the continent to Poland, as a response to Russia, right? Because remember, in the last administration, Russia outright took Crimea and then had, some real success in the Ukraine, but multilateral institutions were not able to deal with that. So Trump comes along, and again, that kind of reinforces his view that multilateralism doesn't get you it's not going to protect you. It's not going to make you safe. Right? And so you have to build up the military. It has to be strong as a deterrent, and you use it when you need to. But definitely, the focus has shifted back to the Indo-Pacific and to the Navy.
Right. Mr. Ross, help me understand this, what, Elizabeth has just mentioned. Is this the shift of the focus from this Afghanistan region and this whole entire region to this side of the world? Or is this something else going on? And help me understand, is this the Trump administration's decision, or is this something which Mr. Biden is also going to do?
Well, when it comes to defense spending and the structure of the U.S. military across the different branches, as Professor Larus said, obviously the United States has been on the ground fighting wars for nearly 20 years in Afghanistan and in Iraq. The war on terror has taken up an enormous amount of resources, but for the future battles, whether they're on the sea or in the air, things like drones, expanding the Navy, the Space Force that was newly created under the Trump administration, it's a different war that will be fought in the future. So whether it's investing in different kinds of equipment, different kinds of training, cyber issues, the personnel training costs. You ask, why is the U.S. spending all this money, but we see it's withdrawing from certain parts of the world. The money is going to be spent, and it's going to be spent on different types of equipment for the next future wars or deterring a future war, and also, again, the personnel costs that are involved. With a Congress that, as of now, looks very likely to be split, with the House still under the control of the Democratic Party, the Senate under the control of the Republican Party, and a president who will either be Biden or Trump, there's going to be the need for the different parties to work together. What that means for defense spending is, despite Biden's hope maybe to spend more money on social spending issues and initiatives in the United States, I think he'll face enormous pressure from the Congress and frankly, from Democratic members of Congress as well as Republicans to maintain the defense spending levels that we've seen in recent years. keeping in mind that they're spending it on different things than they were spending it on 5 or 10 years ago.
Right, right. Thank you so much. We had Mr. Ross Feingold with us, and also we had Elizabeth Larus with us. Thank you so much for your time. प्रोग्राम का वक्त ख़त्म हो चाहता है। आपको इस हवाले से मज़ीद कैपिटल टीवी अपडेट करता रहेगा अमेरिकी इंतखाबात के हवाले से। मेरी मुलाकात आपसे अगले हफ्ते होगी। अपना ख्याल रखिएगा। अल्लाह हाफ़िज़।